over and over and over again. So you have no excuse for not being oriented. That's the good news. If you would, Dr. Dave would love for everybody to come sit close. And I know that's everybody's favorite thing when you're at a conference, to be asked to come sit close. But it will help a lot because he really wants to be with us and among us and have a conversation. So please, please, please come up. We'd love it. And then I will also get to introduce Dr. Dave as well. Some of you may have had him as a professor at the University of Utah. But David Darazotas is a professor in the College of Social Work, director of Peace and Conflict Studies in the College of Humanities, facilitator of the President's Anti-Racism Task Force, and the director of Transforming Classrooms into Inclusive Communities at the University of Utah. Dr. Darazotas earned his PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, and has practiced as a social worker, clinical supervisor, community therapist, and dialogue facilitator. He's authored numerous books, chapters, and articles related to mental health dialogue, spirituality, and global transformation. When not working, he often wanders in the deserts of Colorado's plateaus, which is fantastic. And I'll just add this. I had Dr. Dave as a student at the University of Utah in social work.
I had to yell at Brad often because he wouldn't sit up front.
You're in for a treat.
Yeah. And it'd be wonderful, yeah, if everyone could, because I'm going to walk around and I don't want to walk all over the place to call on you. Are there more people coming, or is this our number?
We may have some trickle in, but I think
Okay.
this might be
All
where
right.
we're at.
Should I wait, Brad? Or okay. All right. Hi, everybody. Brad gave me the absolute worst time to do a program, you know, at the end on a Friday. So what I'm going to do is, if it's okay with you, is try to make it interesting, and maybe even let you out a little bit early. Just don't tell Brad. And he said it was okay if I did that, and because I know you'd like to get home, and I have to drive to Salt Lake tonight. Are you okay with that, or do you want me to go till 8 tonight? What would you prefer?
Let us out early.
Okay. So even if I'm really entertaining, you kind of want to leave early. What do you think, ma'am?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. So raise your hand if you do supervision now, so I just know who you are. Does some of you do it already? And then the rest of you, are you taking this because it's your favorite thing to do on a Friday, or are you thinking someday you will do supervision, or none of the above?
I've done supervision in the past, but some years ago.
Okay. Well, you all know that there's these new rules about supervision, right? And we have the president of our professional organization here to just tell us for a minute. I understand that we have some new rules about supervision, and this training might assist people that want to do that. Is that true, ma'am? You want to introduce yourself for us?
Yes, Dr. Dave, my name's Annika Hunt. I am the current sitting president of the NASW Utah Chapter Board. We are awaiting final rule in what qualifies as supervisor training to do clinical supervision for a mental health license. We anticipate those rules to drop within the next probably 4 to 6 weeks at the state level. So in the meantime, be competent supervisors, and if you are receiving clinical supervision, know what competent supervision should entail. This is as much for you.
Thank you. Okay, so you ready? So I'm going to try to mix this up and have you do some exercises too. So you might ask, well, how in the world could I do that? And I'd say, well, I'm going to wait and see, because I'm going to have you try some things. That makes it more interesting and fun. So this just won't all be talk, okay? So first I want to talk about some basics of supervision. So some of you, you've done supervision before, ma'am, so you probably know all this stuff. And basically, very few of us can say anything anyway that you don't already know. Have you noticed that? You know, because like you tell a client something, like I might say, Mrs. Schmuckelhauser, you know, did you know that, you know, love is difficult but rewarding? And she goes, yeah. Right.
Yes.
So she knew that already, and I just remind her of it. So I think that's a lot of what we do in practice. So let's look at some basics of supervision. So here's a question for you. For 20 Dr. Dave points, and on all expenses paid trip to Panguitch, Utah, for those of you that might want to go there, what is our biggest challenge today? Anybody have a thought about that? This gentleman here might just know the answer for 20 Dr. Dave points. And if you don't, have self-compassion for yourself, because it's okay. But, as a supervisor, I want to think about this, right? Like, what's going on in the world? And, like, what's the biggest challenge for humanity? So what would be your guess today, sir? And it's okay if you don't say what I'm hoping you'll say.
Based off this topic, I'd say lack of leadership or lack of people wanting to take charge of something.
Okay, so let's go with that. So if we don't have good leaders on the planet, what are the chances that 100 years from now, in your opinion, there'll be humans on the world?
0.
Yeah, not too great. So does anybody see that as a problem besides me? Right? Like we have a lot of challenges in terms of this. How about this? To be or not to be? Isn't this the place where you do Shakespeare every summer, Cedar City? Right? Don't you have a Shakespearean festival? So have you heard that one, To Be or Not to Be? Hamlet, right? So I don't know if Shakespeare anticipated our world today, but what does that mean to you? If I said to you, we're trying to figure out whether we're going to be or not as a species, and I'll try to connect this to supervision because I think it's the foundation of everything we're doing. If I say we're trying to decide whether we want to be or not, does that mean anything to you? For example, I have 4 children. They're all in that. You guys have been here all day, right? So you heard the program on adults in transition from adolescence to adulthood. All my children, two from me and 2 from my wife, they're all in their 30s. And none of them have had children yet. Do you know why? Pardon me? They're scared. What are they scared of, do you think, ma'am? If you were that age, what would you be scared of?
To raise children in such a chaotic, scary world.
Yeah, and the world has always probably been chaotic and scary, don't you think? Like if this is in caveman and woman times, right? If this was the Stone Age Cedar City, it was probably tough, living in what's now Cedar City and having to figure out how to kill a woolly mammoth so we could have dinner tonight, that kind of thing. But it seems particularly upsetting. I'm an old man in my 70s, and I don't remember feeling as concerned about the well-being of the world. And I grew up, when I was in high school, we were all getting drafted for Vietnam. There were scary times in our history before. And we'll be talking about that a little bit today. So how about this for an idea? The best theory about anything, including the best theory about practice, the best theory about supervision, is always the most inclusive. The best theory is inclusive. That means it has, it considers all the different things that are important. Most advanced theory is the most inclusive. And I think, I was going to ask Brad, but he's not here. Do you have access to this PowerPoint if you want it? Because I had to send it to Brad. Do you know? We'll ask him if he shows up. Okay, we'll see if he shows up, we'll ask him. Okay, so we'll try to address some of these things and be as inclusive as possible. I want to offer you some basic ideas that I'm a social work professor, that I really like, that social workers value. So one is that artistic factors particularly predict outcomes. So what does that mean? That means that it doesn't matter so much. If you look, my read of the literature is it doesn't matter necessarily what method you use as much as it matters that you can form a relationship with your client. That's an artistic method. We call it artistic because there's no rules. Have you noticed growing up that there aren't any rules about love? Have you ever read a book that said, here's how you should have relationships? You say, oh yeah, that's what I should do, and that works. Because it's an art more than a science. We really don't know. And like I said, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. So you know, the best therapists I know are artists as well as scientists. I would call them, you know, scientific artists. So, you know, our ability to connect with people, to show that we care, matters more than the method. And we are artistic scientists, and we could call ourselves research practitioners, because we pay attention to science. But as you know, because you've all worked in this field, right? What also matters is how I can connect with people, and I'll talk more about that. So we use both practice-based evidence and evidence-based practice. How about that? So what does that mean? Well, you know what evidence-based practice is, right? Because you hear that all the time. You know, as a faculty at the U of U for 33 years, that's all the faculty talked about in our meetings practically. But practice-based evidence is also in the literature, and I think it's just as important. So anybody know what that is? Well, it is measurable, but you know, evidence-based practice is what? You're supposed to read a bunch of articles, right? If I come in and I say I'm depressed, you say, wait a second, Dr. Dave, let me go in the back and read all the articles I can find on bald 70-year-olds who are depressed, right? And then maybe I'll know what to do with you. I'm oversimplifying it, but you get the idea, right? You know, and that might make some sense. You know, practice-based evidence means that I pay attention to your feedback. You know, so like if you're coming in to see me, ma'am, you know, you're my client. At the end of the first session, I might say, Mrs. Schmuckelhauser, you know, so did this help today so far? And then you might say, heck no, you suck. Or you might say, well, sort of. And then I would say, well, like what helped, right? So, and I think that's really important to, you know, to talk with the people we supervise, not just about what it says in the research, because it's always amassed data, you know, an article that summarizes. Typically, that's what we find in the, you know, in the literature. It's also important to ask our clients for feedback, right? And so you might say, this was the worst session ever. I'm never coming back. Or you are the God of therapy, and I sit at your feet, right? Neither response would be particularly helpful. Okay? And please stop me if you have a concern or question, because that works good for me, if you just tell me if this is making sense. Okay. Another thing in social work that I think is important is always thinking about the person in context. You know, so we say person and environment, right? And, you know, so did you remember that one presentation we had where someone had a circle and it showed a little dot in it, and that's what, right? But we're supposed to consider the whole life, and usually we don't know. So the context is important. So one of my professors and mentors used to say, people do the best they can under the circumstances as they see them. What do you think? People do the best they can under the circumstances as they see them. Do you buy this, ma'am? Do you like that saying? People do the best they can under.
Yeah, I like it.
I do too. So I want to understand, you know, what are the circumstances in their life as they saw it? And I always want to ask the people I supervise to try to figure that out. You know, what have they gone through? Where they live? What was their families like? You know, we've heard about trauma today, haven't we? And, you know, everybody, you can have two people. My brother and I both grew up in the same family, and our family trauma was experienced differently by Paul and I. We're all different, right? You know all this already. Another one is the strengths perspective. Do you all know what that is? When I say the strengths perspective, is that A, about how much weight you can lift in the weight room, or B, to notice the things that my client does well and build on them? Which one?
B.
Very good. Yeah. So, you know, we know that noticing people's strengths tends to work better in therapy than just pointing out their weaknesses, right? I mean, raise your hand if you really like it when people say, you know, your weaknesses first. If you went on a first date with someone and they just listed off a number of things at the end of the date that they didn't like, would that make you really attracted to them? You know, maybe if you were a masochist, right? Strengths perspective. And here's one that I think is important. We don't talk about this very much because schools of social work tend to be in universities. And universities tend to especially emphasize science and logic as ways of knowing, don't we? But it's not the only ways of knowing. You know, and I think one of the leading neuroscientists in the world, McGilchrist, this is one of my favorite books, by the way. If you want to buy a book that's really will trip you out, but is also puts you to sleep, so it's a good cure for insomnia, because it's so intense, is The Master and the Emissary, where he talks about a number of things, including these 4 ways of knowing. So intuition, I like to call all body knowing. And we hardly talk about all. When I wrote my first textbook, because professors have to write, right? And if you folks could please come a little bit closer, I'd love it, because we're trying to form a little friendly community. We're hanging out, and I'm walking around asking people questions. Thank you. So talking about intuition is all ways of knowing. So have you ever had the experience, folks, that when a client comes in, you feel something in your body before they even sit down? Does that happen? It's dangerous to nod, by the way, because I'm going to call on you. Yeah. Yeah. So can you think of an example without revealing your client's identity? Can you think of a time recently where you felt something when a client came in?
Well, I've been on vacation for a week, so it might take me a minute to jog my brain.
We're super patient here because we just learned about self-compassion.
I went to Belize. But anyway, so just thinking of like clients coming in, and normally I like to laugh with them, and right, we start out by laughing, and they're not laughing, and they have that look on their face, and I can just feel the heaviness that they have, some pretty heavy stuff they need to talk about.
Yeah, and what are you doing with your hands? You're putting it over your chest, right? Yeah, so you feel something here. You remember our last presenter who was wonderful, right? She was talking about, giving love and compassion to parts of your body where you feel stuff. So we feel stuff. Like I've had clients come in and before they hit the chair, I'm angry. I don't even know why. Has it ever happened to you? Or it might be scared. Like, oh my gosh. Do you ever feel scared when a client comes in? Not terrified that I run out, but I feel fear. There's always a reason why we feel these things. And having sensitivity like that's like, it feels like a problem in the world that we're in, the therapy world. But actually, I don't even know what to do with a client until I have a reaction. It tells me so much about the person. But we're taught in schools not to pay attention to that typically. I was. I went to San Diego State in '78, and they, and it was like, we'll talk about this, and we'll try some exercises around it before we go. We call it countertransference, our reactions to the client, which I think is the most important thing to understand in supervision. So I'm going to emphasize it with you. And we're taught typically in school to ignore it and not have it, and that's a problem to have it. When in fact, one of my favorite students 25 years ago, I think she said in class, oh, I get it now. I don't know what to do with a client till I have an inappropriate countertransference. Either I really like them or I really don't. And I've noticed I do 2 supervision groups now that are monthly. And I've noticed that the clients that people want help with, supervision with, usually the ones we have difficult emotions about. So we're kind of building on this neat program we just saw, because she was talking about difficult emotions. When I have difficult emotions or sensations in my body, it's a clue about the client. We'll study that a little bit today, okay? So that's intuition, all body knowing, all ways of knowing, and then imagination. Why is imagination an important way of knowing? You probably have never heard that before. Imagination is an important way of knowing and doing therapy. Do you ever use imagination?
It accesses curiosity, and curiosity is vital.
Right on, yeah. Like I'm curious about you. I watched you a couple times today, and I like your cool hat, and I'm wondering like what you're about.
I put that hat on when I don't want to do my hair.
So thank you for explaining that.
It saves
Yeah.
a lot of time.
I can imagine that, there's that word, even though I have very little hair, right? I put a hat on my head when I'm cold, which is frequent, right? And I actually wanted to put one on today, but then I thought that might look weird, right, when I'm presenting. So, but I have a hat like yours, a little baseball cap. Imagination is an important way of knowing too. And I think the coolest thing is when I can use all four of those and they're all saying the same thing to me about the client. You know, I'm using my logic, you know. She has a hat on, it's pretty cool. I wonder if she puts that on to cover her hair when she doesn't want
my bald spot?
Oh, your bald spot. When did your bald spot start?
No,
How?
I don't have it yet, but I probably will. I don't
Do you know when my bald spot started?
all over the top.
You know what year, how old I was when I first had it?
41.
Bzz, wrong answer. It started when I was 17. Yeah, so if anyone wants to process that trauma with me, I would definitely, I could get you good insurance for that. Okay, 4 ways of knowing. We'll come back to these things. Let's talk a little bit about this. You probably heard this term 50,000 times, right? Pardon me, ma'am? Well, to me, it's kind of the same thing. I think that's coming up, actually. I think that's the next slide. No, I guess not. Yeah, well, let's talk about it. Well, since I got you talking about this, remember I warned you, don't act interested, because then I'll call on you. If you had to define cultural competency as simply as possible to one of the people you supervise, what would you say it is?
Well, I don't use it anymore, but cultural competency would be learning about different cultures generally. Like you
That's-
might learn about Native Americans, or you might learn about Latin Americans and their cultures, and very generally about.
So all my friends that are people of color get really upset when I say that. Why, do you think? Like if I said to you, if I was a person of color, and I said, well, you know, I have competency about white people because I read Moby Dick, and I read a lot of the classics that were written by white folks. I read some of the books. But what would you say, ma'am?
I would say you have no idea about my culture.
Cultural humility, right? That was a cultural humility statement. So if you had someone that was not a white person and wanted to understand you, what would you hope they would do when they're your therapist? Questions. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's not necessary. I mean, I could read, there's a famous scene, and you ever watched the movie Good Will Hunting? Where, you know, the therapist, who's Robin Williams, you know, is yelling at his client trying to help him, and he said, do you think I could understand you and the fact that you're an orphan if I read Oliver Twist? You know, no. Even though that's about a story about an orphan. So cultural competency, and I think cultural humility is both associated with asking questions out of curiosity. And I have found, tell me if any of you disagree, that when I'm curious about people, they tend to want to talk to me. If I'm genuinely curious. And, you know, my friends and colleagues of color tell me that they're not offended. If I notice a lot of us white folks, we get kind of scared, those of us that identify as white in the room, you know, of asking people of color. But most people of color I know tell me that genuine curiosity, it's okay. Ask me questions, you know, especially in that kind of relationship. Like, tell me what it's like for you. I mean, when I went to UC Berkeley too, like the last speaker, to get my PhD, and, you know, I worked in Oakland, and most of my clients were African Americans. This is a long time ago. And I would ask them, you know, what's it like? The first question I would ask them, you know, or one of the first, and when I would meet with them, is I'd say, you know, what's it like for you to have a white therapist? You know what their typical response was, by the way? Any of you guess? When I asked, this is little baby Dr. Dave, like 40 years ago, when I would ask, you know, my clients who are mostly African American in Oakland, California, what it's like for them to have a white therapist, what do you think their typical response would be? Anybody want to give a shot for 10 Dr. Dave points? Yeah. Although I would imagine it's the same response now. Probably was. I think you're probably right. Yeah. Well, how would you feel if you had a therapist who is a different culture? Because?
Because I'm curious, and I'm curious about people and their cultures.
And so what might be an advantage of having someone that was a different culture as a
They
therapist?
might have a different perspective on life than I do.
And that's exactly what they said. They said, I wouldn't mind talking about what's going on with me with someone that is from somewhere else. Yeah. Yeah. And there's that artistic part again. You know, we're talking about important things about supervision, right? That, you know, the important thing is that I recognize this other person as a human. And like my favorite therapist used to say, I care about them and show them. In fact, Jim said, you know, what's most important is, he used the word love. He said to me once, you know, make sure, you know, that you care about or love your clients and let them know it. And he said, but I just want to tell you a story. So the story was, Jim said one time he told one of his clients, you know, Mary, I love you, you know, before she left, you know, in the session. Because Jim loved his clients. He was a really kind man, and it's one of the reasons why he helped me so much. And he said the only problem was she came back next session and said that she had told her husband about me and wanted to know what we should do next. You know, so of course, and I thought that was sort of a funny story, but it's late in the afternoon on a Friday. But, you know, the woman had misinterpreted it. So when we talk about love, we're not talking about romantic love, right? But caring about people. It's okay to show your clients you care about them. In fact, it might really make a difference. We don't talk about things like that with the people we supervise often, though, do we? You know, why? Why do you think? Why don't we talk about love? You know, when it's so important and central.
Too many definitions for the,
Yeah.
that ethical thing.
Oh, that ethical thing. Oh, right. So another one of my, I mean, I've taught for 33 years, so I've known all these different people, you know, as students. And one of my students said that social workers are boundary monsters. And it always made me laugh, you know. I mean, of course you shouldn't have sex with your clients, right? She wasn't talking about this. She was just saying that we pay so much attention to boundaries, sometimes we forget, you know, to care about our clients. Yeah, so there's so many things that we worry about, that we're afraid to, in any way, show any emotion. And actually, I'm going to be encouraging you to encourage the people that you supervise that it's important to be a human. Did you know that for the last 30 years that clients have, the majority of clients that have been studied in the U.S. say that when we show things about ourselves, you know, do self-disclosure, it helps them? I was taught to never do self-disclosure. I don't know about you all. I wouldn't be surprised if most of you didn't hear that. But clients like self-disclosure, except when what? What would you guess?
When you turn it on yourself instead of focusing on it.
Yeah, when it's for me instead of you. So the example would be like if you said to me, you know, I said, well, Mr. Schmuckelhauser, welcome. You know, what's going on? Why are you here? And you said, well, I'm going through a difficult divorce, let's say. And I immediately burst into tears and I said, well, yes, Mary and I are too. You know, obviously, I'm carried away with my own emotion. You know, if down the road I say, by the way, you know, I have experienced that as well. You know, my therapist used to say, if you're a week ahead of the client, that's far enough. Because often the people I supervise say, you know, I'm worried because, you know, my client came in and they're having problems with, you know, their marriage, and I'm having problems with my marriage. Maybe I should refer them to someone else. And almost always I'll say, no, please don't. Like, you can handle that, and they may not need another rejection. Let's give it a whirl, you know, because you have a relationship with them already. You know, if you're a week ahead of them, that's enough. It's okay to be a human. Does that sound familiar? Didn't we just hear that from the last speaker? It's okay to be a human, right? And cultural humility, you know, we're talking about that, is just realizing that even if I studied your culture for the next 5,000 years, that won't explain you, you know. And actually, that's true of all of us. Like, if I was going to try to explain myself to you, sir, you know, it would take the rest of my life to try to explain what I'm feeling, thinking, experiencing right now, and by then I've changed a million times. You know, and so in a way, we're all existentially alone a little bit. You know what I mean? Like, we can never completely explain ourselves to anybody. But maybe that's okay. Maybe that's not what's important. You know? Okay, here's another question, because we're talking a little bit about diversity, and I know this is kind of a review, but I'm trying to talk about supervision. What is an inclusive environment? So I'm going to ask this woman here with, ma'am, if you had to define the term, see what you get for being in this seminar, what is an inclusive environment? You ever been in one?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
What's going on when it's inclusive?
Well, I think it's an acceptance. You know, you're trying not to be biased about sex, gender, politics, religion.
I like how you said that, we're trying, because inside, raise your hand if you never have a judgment about anyone. Right? A good friend of mine is a Buddhist monk, one of my friends in Salt Lake, and he told me the first day he met his teacher, his guru, the exercise was to sit in a circle with all the new students, and they had to tell their judgments about each other. Why would that be the first day of spiritual teaching? You know, and my friend Phil, he stayed with his teacher for years. But why would a spiritual teacher have his students the first day, the first thing they do is share their judgments with each other? Yes, ma'am.
I think it's to just get them on the table and out of the way.
Yeah, thank you. So that they could heal. So another thing I want to emphasize today is there's a big difference between healing and fixing. You know, and our whole culture is confused about it, and it makes people frustrated with therapy because I don't think we can fix things. So what do I mean by that? In the United States, people think that there's a pill for everything, don't you think? You know, and don't you have I'm depressed. You know, let's say I'm depressed, and I heard about this therapist here. So she's in Cedar City, and she's, you know, ma'am, I've heard that you're really good. I was hoping you could work with me, and you know, I was hoping you could fix my depression, so I'm not depressed anymore. You know, and then you say, because you've had Dr. Dave's training, well, sir, I'm not sure I can make your depression go away, but what we can do is heal it. So what's the difference? Anybody want to take a shot at that? If I haven't tortured you yet, ma'am. So what do you think's the difference?
Learning to process through that emotion.
Oh, I like that. Yeah, I like that. Learning to process through or acknowledging. The word heal means to make whole in Latin. So I like that word a lot because Robert Bly, the famous male men's group guy in San Francisco, he said when we're born with a pizza pie of parts. Imagine do you like pizza, ma'am?
Yes, I do.
What's your favorite kind?
Just regular cheese.
Regular cheese. Okay, so you're born with a cheese pizza pie. Imagine that. And then when you start growing up, people start telling that parts of your pizza that are you are not okay. Like your mom might say, you know, I don't like it when you're angry. You say, oh, Mom, I shouldn't be angry. Okay, I'll put that in my backpack. And the dad says, oh, I don't like it when you cry. Oh, sorry, Dad, I won't cry anymore. And then someone else says, you know, you should always be happy. Yes, teacher. And so Robert Bly says, by the time I'm 18, all I got left is a couple crumbs on my pizza plate. I'm sorry. And so healing is, Robert Bly says, is reclaiming those parts. They're all a part of me, you know. So going back to this example, if I'm depressed and I come to you, and this is important if we're supervising, then we don't promise we can fix because I don't know how to make depression go away in myself. But like a number of people have written, they've noticed that over time, even when I've had the best therapy in the world, what changes is my symptoms never go away, but I become better friends with them. It's one of my favorite quotations. You know, I've noticed that my symptoms never go away. So what does it mean to be better friends with my symptoms? Think of healing. You know, I become friendly with them. Remember our last speaker was saying what we resist does what? What we resist, it rhymes with resist. Persist, thank you. Yeah, get stronger, exactly. Can you relate to this in your own life? Can you totally ever get rid of anxiety, for example? Anxiety is the number one symptom for 40 years now that our clients bring to us in the United States. So you probably, don't you deal with that all the time? Have you ever had a client whose anxiety went away? Brad, have you ever had a client whose anxiety went away? Brad's getting his microphone.
Not yet.
Not yet. Does that mean you're a bad therapist?
No, it means it's functional and there's a purpose for it.
Ah.
Yeah, yeah.
I tell my clients, anybody I work with, it has a purpose and a point. Anxiety has a lot of value. It's how much you have, frequency and intensity. But if my kids at school didn't have a little anxiety, they wouldn't take their tests. They wouldn't pass.
Right on.
Too much.
Are any of you rock climbers? Anybody here a rock climber? Can you, okay, so imagine rock climbing. There's the word imagination. If you had no anxiety, would that make you safer or less safe? Because why?
Because you're not going to use your coping skills. You're not going to be alert. Anxiety pumps blood in your brain.
A plus.
You think, you create too much, shut down, just enough, you...
Plus, plus, plus. What about if you had overwhelming anxiety, the other extreme? Would that help you, being a rock climber?
That'll shut down. That'll freeze or fight or flight. But no, anxiety has a great deal of importance in our lives.
So to illustrate this, I often say this to people that come in and say they're anxious. Like, like pretend you come in to see me for your anxiety. And I'll say, well, tell me how bad it is, Mr. Schmuckelhauser. I use the word Schmuckelhauser as a generic name. And you go, well, I'm having panic attacks all the time. And I'll say, oh, Mr. Schmuckelhauser, could you please do that for me so I could see what that's like? What happens every time when you ask someone to do that? They can't do it. Why? Why? Why can't people? I mean, when your car breaks down, don't you want your mechanic to see that? And sometimes the darn car works. And he says, well, I don't see it right now, right? Why can't people have a panic attack? The reason is what we're talking about. You can't control it. Ah, yeah. So therefore, that suggests that panic attacks are caused by what kind of a relationship with my anxiety? People who have panic attacks have what kind of relationship with their anxiety? Do they accept and love their anxiety? No. Instead, what do they feel when they get anxious? It might be angry. Anything else?
Out of control.
So that makes them feel
Anxious.
yes. So anxiety, typically, does this make sense? This common trait that people come to us, and the Surgeon General said, did you notice last year, Surgeon General said, we have an epidemic of anxiety in our culture. And he talked about across the age span, but especially adolescents and young adults. It's like doubled and tripled. At the U of U, at the counseling center, they said twice as many students with anxiety in like 3 years. You seen this in your school too, Beth? Okay, so panic attacks are caused by fear of fear. And what we resist does what? Persists and gets stronger, right? So that's what we mean by the difference between healing and fixing. So the client comes in and they've been trying to change things. Because remember, we were talking about this in just the last presentation that, which was so well done, this idea that, we fight what is, right? I mean, anxiety isn't pleasant, but like you all said, it's for a purpose. It wouldn't be in our consciousness if it hadn't evolved for a purpose, right? So can you see how important it is, the supervision? Because a lot of our therapists think they have to fix people and then they feel like they're a failure, But if we lower the expectations of the people we supervise, everybody benefits. It's in a way, it's helping them with their self-compassion, if you want to call it that, okay? Like, it's okay. So I would say to you that the main thing that I've done in my career that has helped me be successful and all the stuff I do is lowering the expectations I have of myself, to things that I could do good enough. My therapist, Jim, who I mentioned already, he said to me one day, Dave, if you just try to be a good enough therapist, a good enough professor, a good enough daddy, good enough husband, it'd be a lot better. And I didn't talk to him for 3 months because, he was right. And I didn't want to lower my expectations, but I got the idea after a while. Anybody want to react to that or say anything? Yes, ma'am.
Well, I was just thinking, like, people live up to your expectations, I feel like. So if you have higher expectations, then they might go for more. But if you lower it, they might sense that, and then they may not feel like you have the confidence in them.
I think you're absolutely right about a small percentage of people. I think there are some people that I would not say, Mr. Schmuckelhauser, you need to lower your expectations, because they don't see the potential they have. So I agree with you. On the other hand, there are many people that are so hard on themselves, And I would say most of the people I know, in fact, both might be true at the same time with someone. Can you imagine that? Remember we said imagination is a way of knowing. Is it possible that I could not see my potential and at the same time be hard on myself? Right? So it's not simple, is it? You can't say the same thing to everybody and expect them to heal, to become whole. Like you pointed out, thank you. Yeah. But I don't believe that feeling shame, which is not enoughness, our last speaker talked a lot about, self-compassion, and it reminds me a lot about, what I think about shame, which is a feeling of not enough, right? That's very common. That probably evolved for a purpose. If we have time, we could talk about it if you're curious. I think it evolved for a purpose, But I don't think shame typically makes us more, fulfill our potential, because I'm always going to be dissatisfied with who I am. One of my favorite things about that, notice how I tell little stories? I like to do those stories like that and use quotations when I supervise. So one of my favorite stories is about the Battle of Greasy Grass. Does anybody know what white people call that battle? The Battle of Greasy Grass is Custer's last stand. I just know this because I worked with Ute and Navajo people for a long time in Salt Lake. So at the Battle of Greasy Grass, Crazy Horse, one of the stories is Crazy Horse, one of the generals, one of the leaders said to his warriors before the battle, "Today is a good day to die." Have you ever heard that story? Today is a good day to die. So I asked him, well, why did Crazy Horse tell his warriors today? I mean, would a general do you want to tell your soldiers that? Isn't that just, does anybody have a thought about that? Like, I'm going to ask this gentleman here because I just have a feeling So why do you think Crazy Horse would tell his generals on the day that Custer showed up, wanting to murder everybody down there in the village? Why did he tell his warriors today's a good day to die? Any guess?
I think just managing expectations, and if you expect it, then they're going to fight harder.
Yeah, that I could die in this battle. And I like that. Thank you, sir. And what I was told is that he, also meant that I've lived my life in such a way that if I have to die today, I'm okay. How about that for a cool idea? And I like to use that when I do supervision, that's a reasonable goal for people. Say that again, ma'am?
Today's a good day to die. It's like, okay, I've lived my life a certain way to the best of my ability, and this has meaning for me. I am taking a stand. I am a warrior. And
Yeah, thank you. I kind of think that like if I can live as if today's a good day to die, if I have to, I'd like to be there. I'd like to feel that way. And one of the talks I like to give is on how important death is, people's relationship with their own death and their mental health and physical health. And maybe we could touch on that today if you want. Remember, you can ask me questions and steer me in different directions.
I just digress, but I knew your name sounded familiar. I think it was an NASW conference where you talked about death.
Yeah, I probably did.
And there was some topic of that, and I still remember you asked people to think about why do you get up in the morning.
Yeah. 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 Irving Yalom probably said it best in his book, Staring at the Sun. If you want to read a cool book about therapy, read Staring at the Sun is about how death is usually an issue in any mental health challenge. Because we all know that we're going to die. And so my relationship with death means, how do I deal with loss and endings? You know? And there's a saying that I saw once, it came from Krishnamurti, the Indian philosopher, and he said, you know, it's important to die a little bit every day. So what did he mean? He didn't, of course, mean death. What he meant was, you know, to recognize what just happened and, you know, my losses, the thing, because I'll never have this day again, you know. And every day, every day there's something I could let go of that's not me. He said, death is letting go of things that aren't me, you know. And it's not a philosophy class today, but I love bringing up stuff like that in supervision because I think it encourages people to, you know, to think about therapy in ways that are useful. Because I agree with Yalom that, you know, my relationship with life and death are always related to my psychosocial well-being, you know. Anybody else want to talk about that? Remember, I'm trying to keep you interested at an awful time on a Friday. So please let me know if there's something you want to talk about more. One more question about diversity, and we'll move on. What is a microaggression? You've all heard that term by now, right? Does anybody here ever commit microaggressions? I only do it about 20 times a day. Not intentionally, because they're usually not intentional. And there's an example on the slide, isn't there? You know, this African-American woman who identifies that way says, puts up the sign, know where you're really from. What is she referring to? What's a question that people might ask her? Because they have a stereotype. Yeah. So because the stereotype is, you know, black folks don't come from San Diego, right? And of course, come from Africa. So that's an example of a microaggression. It's something I think worth talking about when you do supervision. You know, that a good friend of mine who's African American, David, says, you know, it's like getting mosquito bit to death. You know, it doesn't kill you. And he says, whether you spill hot coffee on me intentionally or not, it still hurts. Right? So just being aware of that. And that happens all the time. Don't you think we stereotype each other? Let me give you an example because this is sort of fun. Okay, so I don't think you and I have met, sir. Have we? Oh my God. See, I don't remember. 20 years ago? I usually remember faces. So my apologies for not remembering. Okay, so going back to that time when you first met me in class, what class did you take from me? Okay, well good, I'm not the only one that forgets. Okay, what do you think how did you label me as what kind of person? If you had to use a word, Dr. Dave is probably a blank. What kind of person would you say? Thank you. So don't I kind of act like a hippie a little bit? She's giggling. Would you be, yeah, thank you. So that's right, don't I have a hippie vibe? So what are the 3 stereotypes that people have about hippies? We hug what? Trees. And what about our sexuality? We're very promiscuous, yeah, and fluid. And then what's the other one? Oh, and we smoke. Yeah, we smoke weed. So whether or not that's true, isn't it easy to stereotype me that way? And here's the thing that fascinates me, because I'm really interested in climate crisis. You know, what are the 3 stereotypes that people have about climate change activists? The same 3 things. Tree hugger, they're liberal and they're hippies, so therefore it's smoke weed, promiscuous, and hug trees, right? And so that's why it's dangerous, you know. And that's one of the reasons why we're in the situation we're in nationally, I think. Don't you think, and globally? You know, that the tendency, which is a left brain tendency to put things in categories, that probably saved our butts when we were in the Stone Age, because if we saw people from another tribe, let's say, maybe we were more cautious. They're from that tribe, maybe they'll eat us or hate us or steal our animals or something, right? Maybe it served a function. But today, that tendency to stereotype, which sometimes reflects truth and sometimes doesn't it make it difficult for us to cooperate, to deal with issues, right? What's happening in our country today? We have a presidential election where everything is just 50-50. We don't know who's, why are we so divided? Isn't it weird how close it seems, and how nasty the language is about each other, taking stereotypes and all that. You know all this already. By the way, I bring that up. I know this isn't a politics lecture, but I don't have a client that's not disturbed by that. Do you? Everybody I know has this on their mind somewhere. They may not think about it every day, like some of us might, but it bothers them. There's a reason why the Surgeon General, noted that depression and anxiety has skyrocketed in the United States, just in a few years, especially with young people. All right. Yay. Wait, I gotta get the microphone. I'm so excited, there's a question.
Do you think that that correlates with the divisiveness and the lack of unity that's going on?
I'll answer that, but I'm going to turn it back on you. Do you think it does?
I do.
I totally agree. Yeah. And I think that being a therapist is a way to do something about that. Don't you all? If you're worried about changing the world a little bit, every time you see somebody, like my friend here who I had as a student who I don't remember, like every time you're a therapist, don't you have a chance to change the world a little bit? And if you get Mr. Schmuckelhauser to stop being a patriarchal jerk with his family, doesn't that change things, for example? Huge, because then his wife feels different, his kids feel different, the neighbors probably do. He doesn't have road rage anymore. I don't have to hear on the news, just this last week or two, wasn't there 3 people killed in Salt Lake City from road rage, right? So every time I help people moderate their emotions, or change their behaviors a little bit, think a little differently, stop stereotyping, we're changing the world. Yes, ma'am. Yay, people are asking me things.
One thing that I like to think about is that this is why I'm doing what I'm doing, is to change people's lives. And it's okay if that one person that I change their life is me.
Right on. Give me a rock. So, yeah, it is okay. Yeah. And so I like to talk about that with the people I supervise. Why do you do this work? Right? What motivates you? I want to talk about this because, remember, the most advanced theory is the most what? Inclusive. So we want an eco-bio-psychosocial spiritual assessment approach. So what the heck does that mean? So we'll just do this briefly. So eco is ecological. So that's what culture am I from? What do the mountains look like where I live? What's the culture? That's Salt Lake City. I love the way your town here is right underneath those red cliffs. I just think it's really, really pretty. Those things affect us. It's part of the context. So eco means, the natural environment. So that's a part of our wealth, right? And how people think and act in my family and my culture. We all know this. So that's the eco. And you know how to assess that. There's also the biological. So we're not doctors and nurses, but we want to ask people, what's their relationship with their body? What percentage of people in the United States accept their bodies as adults, do you think? A, 20%, B, 40%, or C, 60%? 20, if that, yeah. Most of us actually don't like our bodies at all, right? So that's part of the bio. We're not, again, medical people, but we can talk about how people view their bodies, what their relationship with their bodies are. Do they take care of them, right? By the way, why do social workers suck at self-care? Because we're always saying, self-care, self-care. you know, like they'll always ask us faculty, you know, to welcome the new students and do these little seminars, and I listen to my colleagues say, self-care, self-care. And I know they suck at it because all they do all day is like publish and write things, right? So why are we such big, fat hypocrites about self-care?
It's always easier to talk than do.
Well, for sure, I agree with you. Yeah, I mean, we know it's important, but are there pressures being a social worker to be productive? Duh, right? Right? And does the university where we train people to be social workers, is there any pressure there, Brad? Do faculty ever feel any pressure? Not at all, right? So it's huge. Like, I mean, I was at Berkeley, and I thought that was pressure, but then I had a faculty job. My goodness. You know, one time towards the end of my career when I didn't care anymore, but I was kind of always a little bit antisocial, like, you know, in the sense that I didn't like rules. You know, the dean would have, you know, I was on this group of people that were calling the steering committee. So we all felt really important, Brad, you know, like we're the steering committee. So we'd meet with the dean, and he'd start the meeting and say, what are you all up to? Because we meet once a month, so people would say, you know, one person next to me would say, well, I've, you know, published 12 books. I just brought in $1 million to the school, and, you know, I learned how to fly. And everybody's like, oh, great, that's wonderful. So there's all this, and we're kind of outdoing each other. So when it's my turn, I said, and it was the truth, I was really, really sick. I got a bad cold, and I had to take a couple days off, which I never do. And I said, when I came back, I realized how exhausted I am in general. Even though the cold was gone, I got in touch with that. And I don't want to do that to myself anymore. And it was quiet, and I thought he'd yell at me. I won't say which dean it was. But to his credit, I thought he said, that's a good thing for us to consider, you know. But that was heresy at my school. Yes, ma'am.
I don't know that I agree with the correlation between self-care and career, meaning that because we choose our particular profession, it indicates whether we have self-care or not. In most cases that I've observed, self-care is something that you learn in your home as you're growing up. And if you have not seen that in your caregivers or your parents, it doesn't really matter what career you go into. I don't think that they're one and the same.
Yes.
I think it really comes from what you learn at home from watching your parents, your grandparents, whoever's caregiving you, because that's where you learn your basic traits of life. And I think that, to me, is the number one indicative thing for care.
What's your first name, ma'am?
Susan.
So isn't Susan right? Yeah. And so what did Susan just do that no one's done yet in our sort of inclusive community? Remember that term? I wore a hat. She wore a hat. Other people have hats. What did she do? Did she do something else? Come on, you know. What did she just do that no one else has done with me yet? Yes. Yes. So we want to teach the people that we supervise about disagreement, you know, that it's a gift. I mean, it might hurt a little bit. Like, of course, there's a part of me that wants to always be right. And what I realized is I didn't explain it good, because I totally agree with you, you know. So thank you for disagreeing with me. And I don't think that it is the profession, but it might be that people that, because we're all caretakers. You know, don't you think we tend to be caretakers? And the old term for it in DSM-3 was neurotic, and then they got rid of it because they decided they didn't want that term. But basically, we're all kind of more neurotic, which is caregivers, or we're more access to, in a way, we're takers. You know, we could divide people as simplistic, right? Social workers tend to we kind of take care of people, and that's not bad. My therapist used to say the goal is not to stop being neurotic, it's to moderate it, be sort of a little bit neurotic. Because I was like way neurotic back then. You know, in other words, give, and never take anything. Like if you try to be nice to me, I'd say, oh, I'm fine. You know, I'm dying of the flu here, but I'll work all week, right? You know, so maybe this profession attracts people like that. What do you think? Is that possible? Do you think that, do you think it's possible that, Susan, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you think it's possible that people that are kind of neurotic, as we just defined it, are attracted to social work because we get to take care of everybody? In the Enneagram, that would be
And
called,
you want to apply that to physicians and nurses?
to some degree, although
I mean, we're talking about
we are.
caregiving in so many different ways.
I think nurses, what I've read is that, you know what the main reason why people become physicians is? Because it's different than nurses and social workers. Nurses and social workers say the main reason they went into the profession is to help.
Then do you want to extend it to politicians, considering this time of year?
Great question.
How far do you want to take that?
I'm an extremist. I may take this really far. I like how you tease me. So, yeah. So anyway, we can think about maybe being less hypocritical. And the reason I bring that up is simply that with the people I supervise, I ask them whether they model self-care. And again, thinking about our last speaker, I like how she brought it back to self-compassion. You know, that, like with the woman who's sitting next to me that I met, you know, who was talking about having a husband who's on the spectrum. Remember that question? And I like how the speaker said, you know, maybe self-compassion for yourself would be good for your husband, right? You know, and so maybe learning to do better self-care is the best way for me to encourage my clients to. You know, in other words, we model. Part of being a therapist is modeling. Okay, let's go a little bit further. So psychological. And that, you know, we're talking about assessments. So one of the things I want to notice is my client able to see their emotions? Do they have emotional intelligence, and can they express them effectively? In fact, my favorite definition of empowerment is knowing what I feel and think and expressing it effectively. Effectively means not causing unnecessary harm, you know, to myself and others, and maybe getting my needs met. So I want to assess that, and then maybe I want to look at their social, you know, the social parts of their life. Do they have, and a big part of that is formal and informal support systems. And you know, are any of these support systems inclusive? Wasn't it you that I asked about inclusive, ma'am? Wasn't it you that defined inclusive community, or was it somebody else?
I think it was someone else.
Oh, it was you. I know it was in this part of, at least I got the part of the room right. But yeah, you know, I mean, maybe I belong to a bunch of communities, but none are inclusive. And one of the things I would add to what you said, which I like, is an inclusive environment welcomes me. Is it welcoming? You know, so do you have welcoming environments? Is your family a welcoming environment? You know, when you were a kid, was it? You know, was your community, if you went to church, was your church welcoming? Was your school welcoming? And then finally, the spiritual. And I just want to talk about this for a minute because we're in Utah, right? So is spiritual and religious the same or different? And this has been part of my research. One of the reasons I wanted to go to Salt Lake, because there was another faculty when I first came here in '89 that studied religiosity and spirituality and its connection with well-being. So how are spirituality and religion different? Anybody want to take a stab at that? Yes, ma'am.
I feel like religion is more organized and spiritual is more internal.
Very good. Yes, in the literature they'll say spirituality is an individual level of development, like physical development, social, and that religiosity is a social, usually a social function where we share beliefs, rituals, doctrines. Okay, so people can be both spiritual and religious. They can identify with neither, or they could be one or the other. And the fastest growing groups in the United States right now are people that say they're religious and spiritual both. Second fastest category is spiritual but not religious. You know, that's what's just happening now. So I ask, you know, my clients to consider the spiritual dimension. It's not being a minister. I don't want to be a minister. I don't know what happens when you die. I'm not going to pretend to, for example, right? I like being a social worker because I can just say, I don't know about that, but how do you want to live your life? You know, I can talk about that with you, but not super comfortable preaching about those kinds of things. You know, maybe you identify with that, but I think spirituality is a big part of our lives, as defined by this, that my favorite synonym for spirituality, and it's in the literature all over the place, is connection. So as I become more spiritually mature, I feel more connected. Notice the connection I have with other people, with other living things, with the environment, with the universe, if you will. Is that important, do you think, to well-being? You ever think about that? You ever ask, does my client feel connected? I have a friend who's a psychiatrist, and he wrote this article on connection disorder. He submitted it to the DSM people. They didn't like it. But I think there could be such a thing if we have to have a DSM, an inability to feel connected. If we feel connected to our environment, are we more or less likely to have a climate crisis, for example? If we feel connected to other human beings, are we more or less likely to have war, right? If we feel connected to other human beings, are we more or less likely to be abusive to people? You know the answer, right? So that's eco-biopsychosocial spiritual assessment. Less than an hour to go, almost. And we'll move to some experiential stuff in just a few minutes. I just want to cover one more piece, which is that there's all these different ways to help people. And my read of the literature as a professor, because I've taught these practice classes for years and years, is that there's insufficient evidence to say that any one method is more effective. And so the way I work with the people I supervise and what I teach in my classes is be willing to draw from all the methods available in helping people. One of the reasons I say that is because I know after being at Berkeley that one of the reasons you hear more about CBT and other cognitive behavioral methods is because that's mainly what people research today. Why don't people research experiential or psychodynamic as much? It's not that they never are researched, because they're not as popular. And I'm an old guy, I'm in my 70s, so I've seen different kinds of approaches come and go. Like in the 80s, do you know what was popular in the 80s? It's changed, right? In fact, I'll start in the 60s. When I was just going to college, the 60s was experiential. I wasn't born yet when psychodynamic was popular. I'll show you psychodynamic. So, see, the philosophy of therapy changes as the culture changes over time. We know this. So, I'll go back to Maslow in a second. Just go to, here's the 5 approaches, and psychodynamic, let's go to psychodynamic. Psychodynamic started around 1900, a little bit before with Freud. So none of us were around then. But it fit the culture back then, because one of the things that happened was people were coming to therapists talking about sexual abuse in their families. And Freud's first theory was, that sexual abuse the trauma of that had caused these problems in the symptoms. And he got shouted down, so he changed it to sexual repression. But the point is just that looking at the past to understand it, which of course is trauma-informed therapy. I mean, he brought it up. He wasn't the first person to ever think of it, and it was appropriate to that era, and it was in like a kind of a conservative Austria, in Europe, But then things changed after that. Yes, ma'am.
I hear more, and I know the internal family system has been around for a while, and the gentleman spoke about it yesterday. Yeah. But to me, I haven't studied it, but to me it sounds like the more modern psychodynamic psychotherapy.
Exactly, yeah. So
and
that's...
using different terminology. And
yeah, so Brad left, because I was picking on him. So like what happens is that you have to publish or you perish in academia. So I will just give a new name to something that existed before. And Freud wasn't the first person to realize that the past messes you up. The ancient Greeks and Romans talked about it. Probably cavemen and women talked about it. It's pretty obvious, right? If you're thoughtful at all. So yeah, it is kind of repackaged stuff, and...
even from the 1980s. I mean, I also studied it at that time, whenever.
Yes. Yeah, so those of us that are old, like me, you're youngin' yet compared to me. We can see that that all these approaches probably have always existed, but just weren't named the same. So all psychodynamic about is healing the past. Remember, healing is just being whole. to get my needs better met in the present. You know, we can still use that today. In some cases, I mean, I can't not use psychodynamic. Like if you come in and you say you're depressed, I should ask you, when did it start? You know, how old are you today? I'm 23. When was the first time you remember you being depressed? You know, because I'm trying to figure out, you know, what's the etiology? What's the cause? So if you first felt depressed as a teenager, what was happening then for you, ma'am? You know, it just makes sense, right, to ask that question. Freudian therapy is very out, though. It's not popular. You know, one of the reasons is he said some things that are kind of dumb, like penis envy. Like, maybe there is penis envy in women, but then there's got to be womb envy in men, wouldn't you think? You know, and so we object to that, but you don't have to throw out the whole thing just because Freud said some dumb things, I think, right? Or take CBT. You know, it started out, you know, early 1900s in reaction to psychodynamic. It's because people said, you know, if all you do is sit around and talk about how messed up your mother was, that's not going to necessarily make you better, which isn't exactly what Freud did, but you get the idea. So they said, they moved to the opposite. Let's get active. Like, you know, let's change the way we think and act, not just analyze and whine about the past, Freud. I mean, it was a valid point, right? And so, you know, and that's had a bunch of waves since then, but you get the idea. And then, you know, in the 60s, which, by the way, was the greatest decade of the last century, you know, and some of my heroes there on the pages, the experiential therapies, which is the third force, you know, and what's that about? That's about emotion, noticing what you're feeling primarily and expressing it effectively, which had not been, sort of CBT kind of said, well, emotions are just from cognitions that are unhealthy. To me and to many people, it goes both ways. Yes, the stories that I tell myself affect my emotions, but sometimes my emotions affect the stories I tell myself. You know, so none of these replace the other ones. They're just talking about the fact we're multidimensional beings. I mean, why wouldn't we want to ask about emotions and cognition and behaviors and the past? And how about transpersonalism in the 70s and 80s, which merely just said, let's add spirituality, our feeling of connection, our sense of meaning and purpose. It's hardly studied. I was in on this first group called the Society for Spirituality and Social Work that started meeting in the 80s. You know, we had this little group of people that would meet at national conferences. It was all controversial. You know, one of my professors in Berkeley said, you haven't joined that group, have you, David? You know, but it's gained more acceptance. And it's not meant to replace the others, but just to add this spiritual dimension, because we're eco-bio-psychosocial spiritual beings, right? You get the idea. And I wanted to present that to you just as a supervisor, maybe to allow people to experiment with these different methods, because I think we need all the methods we can use. And human beings are multidimensional beings, you know? That's what I think. And you don't have to agree with me to get an A for this class, okay? The biopsychosocial paradigm is connecting the body, mind, and spirit. So it's simply just saying that how I treat my body affects my psychological well-being, and my psychological well-being is associated with my physical being. You know, from that we get things like, what is the #1 treatment in the United States, the most effective for depression and anxiety symptoms? Anybody know? I'll ask my students this. So I'll give you three answers. Psychotropic meds, talk therapy, aerobic exercise. Aerobic exercise. Why don't we talk about it more? You know, I mean, it's really clear in the literature, the way I read it. You know, it's cheap, usually. That doesn't mean if I have I'm a volunteer now at the local senior center where I live. And, you know, I wouldn't encourage people there to, you know, climb Mount Everest, but maybe to walk their dogs. Aerobic exercise is different for different people, right? But we have bodies, we're animals, it's good for us to move, and it reduces anxiety and depression. By the way, what's #2? Most effective, is it talk therapy, or is it, talk therapy is #2. #3, yeah. I agree with you, Susan. Yeah, so talk therapy is second, and then third is psychotropic meds. That's over-the-counter head meds. That's what my kids call it. Yeah. So knowing those kinds of things, you know, and I mean, we can't diagnose, as you know, like a doctor can, but we can talk about these things and the research, you know. And then eco-psychology, which is the newest paradigm, you know, and so that's linking the well-being of the ecosystems I live in with my own individual well-being. So what the heck does that mean? So what's the busiest street in Cedar City? Is it the street? I always stayed at the Best Western. We stayed at the Best Western, and there's like a main highway there. What's it, 65 or 62? So let's say if you lived, I think that looked like the busiest street along with Main Street. Is that right? I mean, so if you live within a block or two of those two main streets in Cedar City, your children score immeasurably less on intelligence tests. So why would that be? There's a link between living near a busy street and children's scores on intelligence tests. Why would you think that is? This is part of eco-psychology. So we don't know for sure how much of that has to do with pollution, because that's probably a factor. You know, breathing exhaust. There's higher exhaust levels within a couple blocks of a busy. We don't know how much of it is noise, but noise is a factor. It impacts us animals, because our ancestors didn't live near busy streets, did they? 10,000 years ago. You know, we don't know how much is other stressors related to traffic. You know, but it affects. So that's impressive, isn't it? And we all sort of know that's true. In fact, if you go to what's the name of the hospital in Cedar City? You probably got one. Does anybody know? Cedar City Hospital is a good name. So if I go to Cedar City Hospital, and let's say I have to get stents put in to hold off a heart attack, if you put me in a recovery room where I can see the cool red cliffs that I could see from my motel room, you recover faster than if it's looking towards the back of another building. If there's a plant in the room, I recover faster. You know. By the way, if you have a pet that you love, you know, your mental and physical health indicators are better. So we have a connection with nature, you know, that's inherent. It just makes sense because we came from nature, right? You know, and that's what this is about. So what would that look like in therapy? Like I live in Salt Lake City, but above us is Park City. And I have friends in Park City that are social workers, and what they do is they take walks with their clients up in the trails with their permission, you know. And there's evidence that can really be helpful to some clients. I mean, I can tell you a story about one guy I work with that his daughter came into the room in the middle of the night, who was 13, dropped dead on the floor from a hemorrhage. Tragic death for him, you know, and his wife to deal with. I didn't know how to help him. You know, I tried all my Dr. Dave stuff. So one day we decided to take a walk up campus to this thing called Red Butte, which is really pretty up above campus. And what was it? It almost makes me cry to remember. It's what's that bird that goes in the spring? It's a white and black bird that you see during the winter, eats seeds. Chickadee. You know chickadees, right? They're sweet little birdies. They go, it's their mating call in the spring. We saw a chickadee, and he said, every time I see a chickadee, I remember, that's my daughter. I feel like she's speaking to me. Isn't that trippy? And so trippy is a hippie word, which you translate to mean profound, right? And so that started this conversation, and he finally had a breakthrough. I'm not saying just because you take a walk with somebody, they'll automatically have a breakthrough. But nature has all these, Hillman called nature the great healer when nothing else works. Like I know in my life, when I was bummed and I had it with humanity, Mother Nature always seemed to give me a hug when I went outside. Trees don't, you know, they don't give you a hard time, you know, when you sit under them. So the idea here would be making partners with nature. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's go to the part where I want to do some work with you, and I hope this is helpful. I think this is fundamental to supervision, and that's transference and countertransference, okay? And then we'll try some exercises. So our most difficult cases almost always involve difficult countertransferences. And so when the people you supervise say, if you say to them, do you want to talk about a client? And they go, yeah, I got this one. Most of the time it's because they're having difficult reactions to the client. And so let me ask you, let's just talk about that for a second. When you think about difficult reactions to your clients, what are some of the most difficult? When you feel what towards your client? Because that's what I'll ask my supervisees, is I'll say,
Run in the other direction?
so I don't like my client because they scare me, or I'm mad at them, or they just make me frustrated. Is that what you mean, something like that?
I see also clients in a hospital where you're also like they're approaching me, they're walking down a hallway, and when I know, like, I have this feeling I want to run in the other direction.
If you gave it an emotion, so what's the feeling you have towards people like that? You feel what towards them? Can you give us an example?
Sometimes it could be like disgust, like revulsion. Or
It's hard to help somebody when you feel disgust. Because if I feel disgust, let's turn around. Let's say I'm your client and I come in for the first session and you're just feeling thick disgust for me. What's your self-talk? Because you're supposed to be a good social worker, right? So when you feel disgust towards your client, does that make you feel good about yourself as a therapist? Not necessarily at all, right? Because we're supposed to be all loving and sweet like Mr. Rogers or Mother Teresa, right?
Then I don't have compassion for them,
Or at least I think I can't. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about, because I am here to tell you there's no such thing as an inappropriate countertransference, and I don't even know what to do till I have one. How about that? Let's turn it completely around 180 degrees. That's why I get excited about this, because most of us have been taught that we're supposed to not have countertransferences, and if we have them, there's something wrong with us. But actually, disgust tells me a lot. What does it tell me? Okay, one question I'll ask, and we'll see a slide about this in a minute, is it possible the client feels that same way about themselves? Think about it. People that disgust you, do you think it's possible they feel self-disgust? Very likely. Not 100%, but likely. Okay, how about this one? Is it possible other people in their life feel that way towards them? Probably. Okay, so imagine, so then I go, if they feel disgust towards themselves and everyone in their life practically feels disgust towards them, including their mother, what's it like being them? Anybody want to say? What would it be like for you if you knew everyone was disgusted with you? How would you feel? Would you be happy? Yes. She said lonely, and that's the first word that comes to me. Everyone's disgusted with me. I'd feel really lonely. All of a sudden then, ma'am, I can have you can have compassion for Dr. Dave, because I disgusted you. Sorry, I'm talking to you when you're... Oh, whew, oh, now I feel good. Professors like it, love it when you write down stuff. So, because it makes me feel so smart, right? So if you're disgusted with me, but then you realize that I'm so lonely because you ask those questions, now can you have a little compassion towards me? Even though I'm disgusting, right? Yeah. And so that's the basic idea right there. So let's look at it a little bit. So what's the difference between transference and countertransference? Absolutely nothing. It just depends on who's feeling it. So transference is what they feel towards us. And then countertransference is what we feel towards them. That's all it means. It's just a big fancy word that Freud came up with. Both these words. So I want to ask the question, what can I learn from my countertransference? Because all of us are exquisitely sensitive to each other. And our reactions to people are not things to ignore, because we need all the data we can get to help people. And when I have a reaction to you, it almost always is something about me and something about you. My therapist, Jim, used to say, the work in a relationship is figuring where I end and you start. And that would include your husband, your wife, your kids, and your clients, and your colleagues, and anybody else. What does that mean? That means when we have a disagreement, a fight, a conflict, any kind of interaction, and we have feelings about it, the work is talking about and trying to figure out what was I feeling, what were you feeling, you know? And usually like in marriage, usually the hardest conflicts are ones where we're both activated at the same time. You know, with our old traumas, you know, our buttons are pushed at the same time, right? Yes, ma'am.
So what if your countertransference is parental? Because a lot of the people that I work with are my kids' age.
Okay, so then I want to ask the question, you know, what can I learn from my countertransference? How much of it is me and how much of it is them, right? What a great question. So you said I tend to feel, if I'm you, I tend to feel this more with younger people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that says something about who? You or the client?
Me.
Yeah, and is that good or bad, right or wrong? No, it's just the way she is. Because are you a Cancer, sun sign? No, so you're Virgo, but you're a loving Virgo, right? And you care about people and you have maternal feelings. So you can kind of go, okay, partly that's me, but it's partly about them, and I bet you don't feel as maternal with all young people. There's probably some young people you'd like to give a maternal kick in the butt, and there's other young people you'd like to hug, right?
Yeah, but what if that's interfering in like your ability to help or not be biased or
It's a great question. Perfect question. So it only interferes because what I resist persists. So countertransference will only mess you up if you refuse to acknowledge it and accept it. The medicine for countertransference initially is consciousness, reverent awareness. It's just what our last speaker was talking about. We're just applying it to something else. So the first thing to do is I notice it and I accept it, because you cannot change it. And if you push it out of your consciousness, you'll overcompensate. Like, for example, if I have hi, welcome. It's okay to come in late. We're an inclusive community, and we love people that come in late or early, right, class? Right? Okay. So, yeah, whatever I feel is, I'm going to even hold it sacred because it's information that I can use to help the person. And I'm just trying to sort it out. How much of it is me? How much is it them? But like you acknowledge, some kids are going to bring up more maternal instinct than others. What kind of kids do you think would? What kind of children makes you kind of want to give them little huggies and love them up?
The ones that look more like my son because he has autism.
Thank you. So why does that stir up that maternal? Because what do you imagine that, what about them makes you feel that impulse, people who have symptoms of autism?
That they don't feel included.
Yeah. So if I'm this kind woman, I have a child who is on the spectrum, and I love them very much, and I know that they don't feel welcomed. You know, the world is not inclusive for people that are neurodiverse, and I want to love them up, right? So then I can ask the question, do they feel that way about themselves, that they're unlovable? Another question would be, do other people reject them? You know, like I imagine maybe they do. And that can give me some compassion. You know, so it's fine to have that desire. I don't think it hurts ever to love somebody and want to express that, you know, and it won't, the goal, you said, would it would it cause bias, right? And I would say, it's impossible not to have bias. Remember when I did that little thing with you, remember, sir, where I said, you know, what did you feel when you first noticed me? Oh, you're a hippie. You see, you smoke pot, you're promiscuous, and what's the other one? You hug trees, right? So it's impossible not to have judgments. Remember my friend, the monk, his guru had the students all talk about their judgments. Because those are some of the things we hide the most. They need to be healed, you know. And healing does not mean make them go away, ma'am. It's acknowledging them. Remember the idea, my symptoms never go away, I just become better friends with them. So as a supervisor, I want to teach people that when they have these difficult countertransferences, to go into it deeper and acknowledge it, and then try to figure out what I can learn about myself and my client from it. So that turns the most difficult thing in being a therapist into the most useful thing. That's why I think it's so cool. The hardest things with my client are actually the signals to me about what they need. It helps me understand them and have compassion for them. And empathy, like we just talked about. Does that sort of make sense, ma'am? Okay. Thanks for that question. All right, so transference is the client's, and I put probation officer because the last time I did this for POs, but it's the reaction that the client has to the professional, okay? And then the countertransference is the therapist's reaction to the client. And it's a combination. They're both combinations of past experiences and here and now. What do I mean by that? Like, when like let's see, I see you, and we're starting this class. So, what's my past experiences would be how did I feel about people that remind me of you? Other females, people with curly hair, people with glasses. Oh, she's probably really smart because she has glasses. Like all those stereotypes we have, right? She has a cool hat. Maybe she's a hippie, right? Or was, or who knows? So that's the past. And then the here and now is we also react to stuff going on in the present because we're exquisitely sensitive to each other, And so why not use that sensitivity? Our work is figuring out the countertransference.
I have a thought on this.
Good.
I've never thought this before, but it just came to me.
Cool.
It seems to me when I'm thinking of countertransference, or the opposite, that it sets in 3 different places in me, and maybe it's true of other people. It can be cognitive, which is a thought.
Yes.
It can also be a feeling.
Yes.
And maybe those 2 are combined. And it can be an action or a behavior.
Totally.
So I'm okay with countertransference if it remains in my head. Even if it remains in my feelings, I'm just not okay with acting on it. So I think we all have it, but I don't think I want to ever think that I could be perfect and never having it. It's just, can I manage it?
You are perfect if you never stop it. You are perfect your whole life, and you'll have millions of countertransferences. Countertransference has nothing to do with imperfection. It's how we're designed. But I agree with you that I especially don't want to react, especially with my first impulse. Because usually my first impulse, my first reaction to anyone is ego-based. Because the ego rules. So what's the ego? That's identification, with myself. So, my first impulse with people, I don't think is to be necessarily trusted. So I kind of want to wait, not out of shame. Oh my gosh, I have a countertransference. What a bad person I am. But more because, just like you said, Susan, and I agree with you, because I just want to think about, why do I feel that way? What's the information? Why do I feel that way towards the client? And I think coming up is the questions I can ask. Okay, so first I want to talk about the 2 kinds of transference. One is demonization, the other one is idealization. They're opposites. So this is, remember, how the clients feel towards us. So clients will either, let's put it this way, your clients will either tend to see you as all bad or all good. That's called splitting. And in psychological theory, we put that in the category of, for example, borderline personality disorder. People that have borderline personality disorder do a lot of splitting. So splitting is what all of us do as children. So pretend like you're my mom and you're my other mom. Okay, I have 2 moms. So you say no, you say yes. So mom number 1, can I have an ice cream cone? Please, mom, can I have ice cream cone? Ice cream cone, please. No. Bad mom, I hate you. You suck. Other mom, can I have an ice cream cone? Good mom, I love you. You're perfect. We do that all the time, even when we're 40 and 70. We act it out when we're children because we're children. We don't have the frontal lobe developed yet. So it's normal to demonize people that don't give us what we want, right? But like Susan reminded us, we don't want to react out of that. we want our clients to love us and think we're wonderful, right? But our clients won't always do that. Maybe not all of us, but that's just an example, right? So does that make sense? What we can do to help clients is to help them see what they have projected on us, but maybe not in the first session. You know, when people, I mean, I would say the majority of people, let me ask you this question. It gets to the same thing and it's more fun. What percentage of what all of us in this room think of each other is projection right now? What percentage of what we think about each other is projection? 90%. Maybe even a little bit higher, but it's around there. How about that? Most of what we think, even when we know people for a long time, you know. By the way, when you fall in love with somebody, that's projection. It's not negative, it's a positive projection. I project on someone, oh, my beloved, you have all these wonderful qualities. And you know, what scientists have found is that I'm projecting on them qualities that I hope to have myself, or wish I did, you know. So I idealize you. You're the goddess. Would you marry me, please? You know, and our clients will will either demonize us or idealize us, and sometimes both in the process of therapy. So demonization is when we're all bad, and idealization is when we're all good. So let me tell you a cool story about this. This is one of my favorite books. Anybody ever read The Inner Gold? So I was telling this story to a client last week, and I'd had her for years, and she just started sobbing, and she had a breakthrough. It's really cool to see that happen for her. So according to Johnson and other Jungian therapists, we all have an inner gold, and that is loving myself. And in the last presentation, she was talking about, remember, self-compassion. It's part of that, you know. Like Dalai Lama, when asked what the purpose of life is, he said to learn to love yourself. It's a big deal, right? Not narcissism, but actually love myself. So, but our clients usually don't love themselves yet. So the idea of inner gold is they're going to give it to you. Like if you're my therapist, ma'am, Robert Johnson says, I give my inner gold to you unconsciously, kind of like you bring your money to the bank. And so when our clients fall in love with us, I'm not talking about romantically, but when they idealize us, what they're really doing is wanting to love themselves, but they're not able to do that yet. So the idea is, I give it to you, and then if you love me back a little, that'll help me, you see. So it's like, I give that to you, and I'm idealizing you. So have you ever had a client idealize you and think you're the goddess or the god? Doesn't that happen sometimes to you, right? Oh, you're so wonderful. So, do you? Yeah, I did it with Jim too. Yeah, it's normal. So, and common. Or we demonize. So let them do it. Let them demonize you or idealize you, because they're going to anyway. You know, don't go, oh, I'm not that great. Don't do it yet. My therapist, Jim, used to say the trick in therapy is to let the client idealize you and then let them down easy. You know, that I'm imperfect like you. But you don't do it all at once. You don't say, oh, stop that. You take it because they're depositing their inner gold, and at some point in the therapy, you give it back to them. And it's really trippy. So I said that to my client the other day, and I'd known her for probably 3 years. And I said, I've been waiting for this time because I'd like to give you back your inner gold, and explained the idea. And she started crying, and we talked about what that meant to her, you know, that you're ready to hold your own, we could call it self-compassion or self-love. That's a cool idea, isn't it? So we just talked about the transferences that clients have toward us that we can help them with over time, either that they're demonizing us and maybe help them see that, and or that they sometimes idealize us. And it can go back and forth. You know, that happens in all relationships, not in just therapeutic ones. You know, you idealize your future partner, right, when you date them. You fall in love, project these positive qualities on them. They might have some of them, but they're not perfect people. And you discover that a couple years down, because about in the average of 18 months, no matter where you live on the planet, the falling in love stage starts to end, right? And you start to see their flaws. But that's the real person now, you see. And so you don't want to go from idealization to demonization, but you usually do. You know what I mean? When your wife or husband starts to, disgust you, there's that word, right? We kind of feel bad, like, did I make a terrible mistake? No, because actually it's in the middle. They're part angel and part not so much angel, just like me, right? And that's when real love can start. When it starts, when we get out of demonization and idealization. So we can use those. Is this making sense a little bit? We can use those in therapy. So now let's just look at countertransference. We said this before. There's no such thing as a wrong countertransference. And what we want to use is consciousness, reverent awareness. It's the same thing the last speaker was talking about with different words. Acceptance with awareness. And so I want to accept my countertransference. And Karen, one of my favorite students back then, she said, I realize now that I often do not know what to do for the client till I see the inappropriate countertransference I have. And here's the questions they ask, and this is what we're going to practice for a while. Then we'll be close to being done. So I'll leave this slide up for you. So I want to ask, what am I feeling and thinking, and accept that. And then I might want to say, what is my attitude towards my countertransference? Remember, we talked about disgust, and then you said, and I appreciate it, you said, I wouldn't feel good if I disgusted my client because I'm supposed to like them. And remember, ma'am, when you said, sometimes I want to love up my kids on the spectrum, and so you have that kind of negative self-talk about it. I won't be objective then, as if we ever are. And then what traits in the client am I reacting to? And is it possible that other people in their life feel the same way? And is it possible the client feels and thinks that same way? So that's the steps. So what I'd like you to do is to sit with someone in the room and do some work. And take turns. I'll tell you when to switch. And one of you start with a client that you have now or have had in the past where you had a difficult countertransference, one that you didn't like, but nevertheless had. And then together, could you explore these questions? So like, say if we're working together, maybe I'll say, I want to go first. You go, fine. And I'll say, okay, I want to talk about my client, Mr. Schmuckelhauser, that I saw last year. And you say, well, what were you feeling and thinking? And I'll answer, and then what was your attitude towards that? Well, I was really embarrassed that I would feel that way towards the client, and so on and so forth. Okay, so what I want you to do is to run, so you can maybe take a picture of this. Brad, did they get a copy of the PowerPoint? Okay, so if you want a copy of the PowerPoint, Brad will send it to you. So does everybody know what I'm asking you to do? Is to sit with a partner. There's 5 people there, so probably one of them will work with you. There's 3 of you. So would the 3 of you work together, or maybe one of you could do this with Brad? So everybody has a partner? I wonder if one of you, maybe the 3 of you could work together. Or maybe one of you could grab Brad and see if he would work with you. Brad, will you work with one of us? Because we have an odd number. Do you mind? She is so fortunate to work with Brad. Okay, so why don't you start and go through these questions together? I'll let you know when you're half done with your time. Five more minutes on this. Okay, when you're done, please switch. When you finish, please go ahead and switch to the other person. About 5 more minutes. Okay, let's come back. Most of you seem to be done. And this is a work that never ends, right? You'll be working on these things the rest of your professional life because we can always get better at it, don't you think? We're always getting slowly better at doing. This is not easy work, but it's possible. You know, so we work on it ourselves and we teach it to the people we supervise. And I just want to show you this last slide. The rest of this PowerPoint you can get from Brad if you'd like. He said he'd send it to you for only $150. I get half. And these are, I listed some currently popular theories, and there's slides on it here with information. The reason I'm not going to present it to you is because I do feel like what I just covered is the basics of all these things. And each of these, from my perspective, emphasizes a slice of the pie that we just looked at holistically, okay? But, you know, I want you to at least be familiar with them so, you know, the remaining slides just, you know, look at some of these things. And, but I'm not going to do that to you at 10 to 5. So it's time for questions, comments, if anybody has them. Deeply felt expressions of gratitude for the, no, just kidding. Anything you'd like to say or ask? If you have energy, any energy or attention left in your body. Yes, ma'am.
So I do still have some questions about countertransference. So I work with students that are suicidal and self-harming, and so then even though I can embrace my countertransference, I do realize that a lot of them I see my own kids or certain behaviors, you know. But then I'm worried about how it influences whether or not I decide that they need to go to the hospital if it's that extreme, you know.
What an important topic, right? So I have a training I do that the whole thing is on this, you know, and still we don't get into everything. What is the most common countertransference we feel when someone tells us they're suicidal? What does that bring up for us? Okay, the 6 basic emotions are sad, mad, glad, scared, excited, disgusted. Scared, yeah. And probably sad, thank you. Yeah, and why do we get scared? Okay, so in my opinion, we have a ridiculous responsibility given to us by society to keep people alive, and it's impossible. If I want to die, let's say I'm 90 and I just found out I have an incurable disease, which might make me want to die, you know, because I feel strongly I have a right to decide that, and it's not the government's decision, and I'm your client. Don't try to talk me out of it because it won't work. And if I want to kill myself, I'll figure out a way to do it, you know. And I'm not saying I would actually kill myself, but I'd want to die with dignity. You know, I'm just giving that as an example. In other words, what I'm saying to you is what you already know. That if, you know, if any of us want to die, we'll probably accomplish that. So that goes completely against the grain. Am I saying we should just be flippant about it? Not at all, right?
A kid that's just beginning their life.
Of course. I feel completely different if your name is Debbie, you're 11, and you want to die because Billy just broke up with you after going steady for 2 days. Yeah, that's different than if you're Dr. Dave and you're 90 and you're falling apart and you're ready to depart, right? Completely different. And I'm not saying, because we're not even talking yet about the decision about hospitalization. And we do live in 2024 United States. And so there's certain rules and regulations and laws and expectations that we have to work with. I'm just talking about countertransference right now, that you're probably going to feel scared and sad, right? But I don't want to act out of fear, because when I act out of fear, it doesn't tend to have good outcomes. I mean, in other words, I don't want to throw you in the hospital because I'm afraid I'm going to get sued. But it's so easy to do that because I'm just being frank, right? Because it's scary, and I have this responsibility. The word responsibility means ability to respond. And if I can't keep you alive, right? Well, you could say maybe it's appropriate to go to the hospital. I'm not sure they can do it either, you know. So it's complex, right? And nuanced. And luckily, you know, I might have a supervisor I can talk to about this that really we can process this. Because to me, a wonderful supervisor is someone that will allow me to talk about my feelings and not make me wrong, you know, just like I'm being honest with you. So I would say when you're a supervisor, do what our last speakers counseled us to do. Have self-compassion for yourself about having to, because now you're scared too, because are they going to sue me because my client does a dumb thing with a suicidal client, right? You know, because that, of course, is going to come up, right?
Well, and there's that, what if I didn't do enough and then they do go ahead with the plans that they made, then I feel horrible.
Yes. You know, and in the presentation I do on suicide, you know, I'm looking at the literature now. For example, a lot of the things we were taught really aren't true. Like, there doesn't appear to be that much of a correlation between making a plan and actually trying to kill myself. And so we ask people still, all over the United States, therapists are asking their clients, do you have a plan? And then we make a decision based on that. But it's not clear that that is associated with actual lethality. You know, like, are they likely to do it? It's hard for us to predict. I mean, I have a hard time predicting what I'm going to do a minute from now, you know, much less somebody else, right? So I think having compassion for my limitations, I start with that. Like, there's only so much I can do. And I'll share with you one of the things that's helped me the most, and I've used with my students and people I supervise that they like. I learned this from something that Carl Jung wrote. He said, whenever someone wants to die, there is always a part of them that needs to die. And when I read that, I thought, oh my goodness, I wish I had thought of that. You know, what a brilliant thing. Like, and I found that to be most of the time true. So I'll give you an example. I have a good friend who runs a business in Salt Lake, and he hired this young man. My friend is part of a real strong LDS community. I'll tell you why that's relevant here, and so is the boy. And the boy, it turns out, was experiencing homosexual, attraction, right? So he was wondering whether he's gay. And turns out that, yes, he's primarily gay. But he felt terrified to bring that up with his parents and, of course, right? Because in that particular community, he was afraid that he would be banished from his family. You know, what was a part of that boy that needed to die? The fear of judgment. Yeah, the fear that, and I don't judge him for that fear. I'd have it too. If I discovered I was gay, and I mean, I grew up in a Lutheran community in northern Illinois, Chicago, and it was certainly not okay to be gay in the 1950s, you know. And if I had that experience, I'd be afraid too, you know. But nevertheless, I have found bringing that up with clients and being frank is helpful. You know, to just say perhaps there's a part of you that you could let go of, that really isn't helpful, and then let's think about that. I don't want to want a person to live more than they do, because I'm not sure I can help them, right? But I'll say to people, if you want to live, I'll roll up my sleeves and I'll try to help you. I don't know if you agree, but to me, people have that decision. Now, at what age do they not have that decision? I'm not sure. I mean, it's an ethics question. Maybe next year we'll have an ethics thing on suicide and talk about it, like at what age, because people disagree. And as you know, some 13-year-olds act like they're 20, some act like they're 5. So I don't even think we can say an age, but, it's a vastly complex thing, and I would say have compassion for yourself, and if you have someone you're supervising, have compassion for them too, around all the pressures we're under to have to be, to know what's best for people. Because I think it's really difficult to know what the highest good is. It's something that I might meditate or pray on. May I have may I know what the highest good is and skillfully support it. But I don't get blessed with that all the time, do you? But that's a gift. If sometimes I have a sense of that, sometimes I'm wrong. Does that help a little bit? So that's the best I can do with 10 minutes left. And guess what? It's 5 o'clock. And so you've survived. I congratulate you all on sticking around late on Friday. We're going to wrap it up now. And unless Brad has some wisdom or something to tell you, we're going to release you into society. So by the powers of the governor's office of the state of Utah, you are now released into society. Okay? Yay.
Yes, big round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Dave. We've got a gift for you.
Oh, cool.
And thank you, everybody, for attending, being here. Happy weekend. Hopefully all goes well for you.
Thank you.
You made it. You made it.